Jose, Usada, or Lurva. Pleasure to be amongst all of you, and thanks for joining us, those who are in Afghanistan and online. Well, this paper is part of a larger project that I am interested as a theory scholar on liberation and pluralism. And the basic question that I try to argue here is how democracy failed in the country. So this is not changing. Okay. Some of the key arguments that I put forward in this paper is that so many people came up with arguments that why democracy failed, why the public failed, and the Taliban took over. So I do argue here that failure of democracy was because of lack of an accommodative system, which should have mediated different moral disagreements in the country. We did have contentions over moral and cultural issues, which reflected them. All of those reflected in public sphere. But the political system and the way the philosophy behind democracy in Afghanistan did not pave the way for certain form of peaceful coexistence amongst those moral disagreements. So in that case, I try to develop a theory of holistic democracy. What I do is first I do review some of the literature on deliberative democracy, who do argue not in context of Afghanistan, but in Western context, how deliberative democracy vis-a-vis the representative democracy present an institutional framework which should address the crisis of democracy that we do observe across the world. And then the second strand of literature are the critical democrats, Chantal Mouffe, a French Bulgarian theorist, who suggests that we do have certain form of moral differences that by anyhow they may not be resolvable. So what we have to do is to just accept those disagreements. And why that's so? Because of two factors. First of all, there might be power dynamics and political and social sphere. And those power dynamics are emerging either from political economy or ethnic or gender issues. And that's why everyone may not have full access and equal access to public sphere. So in the same, this theory suggests a framework which is called agonistic pluralism and decentered public sphere. So when you bring in the larger tensions at the capital or at national level, bring it down to the local and community and enabling people to resolve those disputes at very local level. Now, literature on why democracy fails. So post Donald Trump, the first term, a lot of political scientists explored this, why democracies fail, and that this literature sometimes called democratic backsliding, where established liberal democracies, where they had institutions like judiciary and the free media, but all of a sudden things were falling apart. So the question was, why is so? But in case of Afghanistan, to a large extent, we cannot borrow those literature because Afghanistan, at the end of the day, it was not a well-established liberal democracy. And instead, what the literature which probably is reading well for Afghanistan is those which are bringing both conflict and democracy together. And there's an extensive literature on that, wherein what says that there might be cases, and there are cases where democratization and violent conflicts goes parallel and to hand together, but it brings tensions. That tensions may be over prioritization of order versus freedom and rights, or for example, whether we should prioritize democracy building or stabilization efforts. And finally, also about certain forms of democratic arrangement in terms of elections, that we all observe all of these in case of Afghanistan. Now, in my previous writings, I have argued that we do need to recognize moral and cultural differences in a pluralistic society, but that's not enough. Recognition is not ever enough. And one has to go beyond that and provide the possibility for an open, respectful, deliberative atmosphere where people should go beyond their groups and engage in a conversation and dialogue with the rest. And now, so that's why, putting in that context, I do ask this question: how did contentious disagreement, including moral conflicts, led to failure of democratic order and public sphere in Afghanistan? Now, More mainstream literature now, when they address why democracy failed in Afghanistan, they say Afghanistan failed because it was not enough democracy. And so there's a logic behind that, because democracy does aggregate preferences of individuals through elections. And since elections were rigged and Afghanistan was not enough democracy based on this perspective, that's why it failed. On the other hand, we have this deliberative democracy perspective, which says that decline of democracy should be analyzed through the lens of trust and legitimacy. When the people do not trust in institutions, that, for example, we observe now in the US, there's no trust on court system, even academia, the media, whatever you name in public sphere. And lack of trust is because the way things are polarized. Things are polarized, and that's what we political scientists call it affective polarization, where you do not pay attention to the substance and content of the other side's message, and instead you pick certain things and interpret as versus them. So that's why these scholars argue that even in conflictual and divided society like Afghanistan, deliberative frameworks may address and probably provide certain form of transformative rule to overcome those divisions. However, what we have to also be cautious that deliberation does not happen overnight, and it's not an easy task to just put people together and they will resolve all issues. There might be inequality and differing dimensions, and those may not be resolved through rational deliberation. So how do we do that one? Now, in the case of Afghanistan, definitely we are culturally diverse, meaning that people do follow different values and ways of life. Afghanistan is also segmented in a way that there are racial hierarchies, or as a gender apartheid society, it's now also a gendered society. And finally, Afghanistan is also polarized in terms of which fundamental values should shape the politics. We do not agree on those fundamental values. Name it democracy, human rights, and liberal values. These were not, we should not take it for granted. The last 20 years also, there was lots of debates. Now, what are certain form of exclusions which happened and the people could not participate in an egalitarian certain form of public sphere? Now, the first one is ethnic and gender inequality. But Afghanistan's political system was designed in a way that political power should be distributed across ethnic lines. One ethnic line on top, the others on the bottom, and some others were completely excluded. On top of that, the political economy of war and intervention by the United States also provided a certain form of inequalities, where some of the elites had the opportunity to boost their wealth and their access to power through contracts and access to international troops. And finally, the strong men, or what some people may refer them as warlords, they not only boosted their wealth, but they also tried to shape public debates through establishing their own media outlets and influencing civil society. So most of the civil society were somehow, they were linked to some of these guys, and they were literally functioning like companies or consultancies rather than being proper part of voluntary civic institutions. Afghanistan was also polarized in a way, and that polarization was around identity issues, particularly ethnicity, and that intensified in the latest phases when Ashraf Ghani government tried to manipulate and play with ethnicity in a way that they tried to formalize these categories as a part of state policy. A list of, for example, ethnic groups were developed, and in a country which all resources are distributed based on identity groups. So every small segment of society tried to claim to be a separate ethnic or tribal identity in order to claim resources, as resources were distributed based on that. And finally, over shared values. So if you look at this spectrum of starting from militant Islamists and ending with militant secularists, so Afghanistan had all of these groups like the Taliban or ISPP could be categorized as those of militant Islamists. And then you have radical Islamists like Islam, for example, Hizb ut-Tahrir, they were not militant, but they were propagating very, very radical ideas. And then you have conservative Islamists, for example, the National Clergy Council, Shura Ulama Afghanistan, officially part of the state, but pushing for a certain form of conservative politics. Now, the manifestation of all of those value contentions, what we see is over a couple of examples that I will outline here. But at the same time, these examples also reflect or provided a chance for the people to create certain form of counter publics, push back against certain form of hegemonic and homogenization policies of the state. First one was media outlets. For example, in one case, in 2011, President Karzai, under pressure of the Clergy Council, sent a letter to Hashd and News, asking them to refrain from broadcasting anything which is contrary to Islam and the national interest of the state. While these two outlets were publishing certain reports which documented human rights violations. Similarly, Click Group in 2011 published a long list and I think broadcasted 150 episodes of documentary which documented war crimes in Afghanistan. And so a group of warlords came and pushed back against pulling these media outlets down. What happened that these media outlets pushed back and say that there's nothing against Islam or the national interest or national security of the state. Second one is the woman counter public. The one example is in one TV, television, they broadcasted a program which was called Niqab. The Niqab provided women who were
The mask.
the mask, yes. Those who were experiencing domestic violence, but they were not able to express their identity or narrate their history due to certain forms of discrimination that they may have faced in a conservative society. So they were wearing the niqab, but and the media outlets, which was broadcasted nationally, they were narrating all of these stories, and that have somehow impacted and transformed society. Art and graffiti. One example is which was closer to our experience in American University of Afghanistan, which was covered by these blast walls. ArtLart, which was one of these companies or civil society institutions which were promoting some of these civic values through art. They painted in 2018 a giant portrait of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, which was then negotiating a deal with the government and labeling it as Butcher of Kabul. So then overnight, the government ordered some people that this should be wiped out because that somehow undermined the official peace process. And since the people who were involved in the graffiti, some of them were students in American University of Afghanistan, and the painting was on the walls of the university. So the university also became involved and tried to suppress some of these students. That's why you guys went out and took such kind of step. But the debate which evolved around that somehow shows that despite all these denials and lack of opportunity, people did use different methods and means in order to express themselves. And finally, the last one is Nowruz. So most of you may remember that how Nowruz is increasingly became controversial in Afghanistan, not just based on ethnicity, but primarily based on religion. That some people came forward and said this is the religion of Majusi and Zoroastrian, and it's not based on Islam. So two examples, for example, that this is Abdurrahman, he's a proper Muslim, and he does not observe Zoroastrianism, and he denies whatever is haram. But to counter this, different civic institutions, for example, Penn Association of Afghanistan and Jaman Qalam, they have also presented counter arguments, also different kind of posters to narrate different phases of Nowruz. One of the key examples was that we have to present such shared values as in a framework of civilizational affair, where these cultural items do not belong to one religion or one ethnicity, rather it's shared across the region between different ethnic groups. And that shared heritage will allow us to peacefully coexist with each other. So what at the end I may argue is that all of these mentioned plurality of publics should have provided the possibility for conversations and exchange among individuals of different publics. In other words, plurality demands that different publics interact with one another. But this requires commitment to pluralism, which was somehow missing in Afghanistan. Anyway, so I will stop here and
You're very on time. Thank you.